April 21st, 2021. Something arrived in the mail today. Hashtag mail. Hashtag mail time. Hashtag love. Hashtag happy. Hashtag can't. Hashtag wait. Hashtag Instagram. Hashtag photo of the day. April 22nd, 2021. Video call with a good friend of mine. Hashtag love. Hashtag best friend. Hashtag best friends. Hashtag happy. Hashtag video call. Hashtag friendship at the Anita Tapio. April 25th, 2021. Nails successfully painted. Hashtag nails. Hashtag nail art. Hashtag nail artist. Hashtag nails of Instagram. Hashtag art. Hashtag artwork. Hashtag artist. Hashtag art of the day. Hashtag makeup tutorial. Hashtag makeup. Hashtag beauty. Hashtag beautiful. Hashtag happy. Hashtag love. May 1st, 2021. I am back. I took a little break to head back home for a little bit. My people missed me, as I did them. We talked, and I've learned that I should be trying to study your species a bit closer. Hashtag I'm back bitches. Hashtag I'm back. Hashtag happy. Hashtag love. Hashtag photo of the day. Hashtag Instagram. May 4th, 2021. My molting has finished. The one downside to taking the form of something I'm not is having to shed. Hashtag molt. Hashtag shedding. Hashtag skin. Hashtag happy. Hashtag feeling good. Hashtag love. Hashtag love yourself. Hashtag beauty. Hashtag instagood. Hashtag happy day. May 5th, 2021. I've learned that your species is a fan of art. Well, I decided to do some crafts with my molted skin. I call this art piece the pretty girl everyone loved and was friends with forever. Hashtag feeling good. Hashtag feeling pretty. Hashtag love. Hashtag happy. Hashtag Instagram. Hashtag makeup. Hashtag skincare. Hashtag kiss. June 13th, 2021. Meeting a new friend later today. Hashtag happy. Hashtag hungry. Hashtag love. Hashtag instagood. Hashtag Instagram. Hashtag meeting. Hashtag new friend. Hashtag friend. Hashtag hunger. 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 June 14th, 2021. Just found out I surpassed 100 followers. From what I've heard, this is a big deal on this planet. How shall I repay you wonderful humans for joining me on my journey of getting to know your customs? Let me know below. Hashtag thank you. Hashtag thank. Hashtag thank. Hashtag happy. Hashtag love. Hashtag loved. Hashtag feeling good. Hashtag feeling happy. Hashtag love you. Hashtag 100. Hashtag 100 followers. Hashtag excited. Hashtag Instagram. June 15th, 2021. Off to meet a new friend. What should we do in this empty wasteland? Hashtag hello. Hashtag happy. Hashtag new friends. Hashtag I love you. Hashtag hungry. Hashtag hunger. Hashtag he. Hashtag doesn't. Hashtag believe. Hashtag me. Hashtag Instagram. Hashtag outside. Hashtag outdoors. Hashtag love. June 16th, 2021. Sadly, one of my friends wasn't helping. So, my two friends who are left over will be coming home with me to be studied. They were so excited. Maybe in a bad way, but I tried to reassure them that they will be taken good care of. Ever since some parts of my family wanted to be independent like me, they want to learn how to blend with you all, and that will take studying. #awake. #awakening. #happy. #early morning. #love. #Instagram. #hungry. #looking. #4. #food. #hunger. 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 #don't look away. #keep looking. June 17, 2021. There was a man standing on the sidewalk selling cheesecake. Is this a normal activity? #cheesecake. #what is that? #happy. #nice day. #love. #instagood. #Instagram. #excited. #hungry. #strange planet. June 18, 2021. I had this skin bag filled with bones, tell me to leave. What a fool. #idiot. #what an idiot. #haha. #love. #instagood. #happy. #feeling happy. #beautiful. #hunger. June 19, 2021. Shopping for food, and nobody is out today. #town. #happy. #love. #Instagram. #photography. #I love you. #hungry. #hunger. June 20th, 2021. Ever since arriving to this place, I can't get over how beautiful nature is. It makes me angry to see humans polluting, ruining this beautiful place for the sole purpose of laziness and greed. Really think about that. You were given this chance for life, and you destroy this beautiful place that gives you the very life force to defy it? Noted. #angry. #outside. #outdoors. #happy. #love. #excited. #new friends. #hungry. #hunger. #instagood. #photography. #green. #nature. #nature photography. July 12, 2021. Hello, everyone. I missed you all. Happy face emoji. My two friends are doing well in their new home. #hello. #I'm back. #back. #here I am. #love. #missed you all. #happy. #photography. #photo. #instagood. #excited. Some humans make me want to leave this planet for good, but it's truly the nature that keeps me coming back. #people. #people make me sick. #EW. #gross. #why. #instagood. #happy. #love. #no. #hungry. July 13, 2021. A storm is brewing. #storm. #thunder. #lightning. #happy. #love. #searching. #for. #something new. #need friends. #help. #excited. July 14, 2021. Thirst quenched. Back at home, we consumed a sort of organic material to stay alive, and here on this planet, it appears there are many organic forms to choose from. Another reason some of my family wants to come here, too. Hashtag hunger. Hashtag thirst. Hashtag hungry. Hashtag thirst. Hashtag mess. Hashtag messy. Hashtag happy. Hashtag satisfied. Hashtag instagood. Hashtag Instagram. Hashtag photography. Hashtag love. Hashtag I love you all. July 16, 2021. I am very surprised over 200 individuals are interested to follow me and see what I'm doing in everyday life. It feels like just yesterday I arrived here and began my work. How will I ever repay you, kind souls? Hashtag blessed. Hashtag love. Hashtag loved. Hashtag happy. Hashtag excited. Hashtag instagood. Hashtag Instagram. Hashtag 200 followers. Hashtag wow. Gorged out way too much to celebrate surpassing 200 followers today. Will I gorge out when I get to 300? Of course. Something I do love is the feeling of accomplishment. Seeing the numbers go up makes me feel special. I just can't express how happy I am. Hashtag love. Hashtag love is love. Hashtag happy. Hashtag hungry. Hashtag mess. Hashtag messy. Hashtag yummy. Hashtag instagood. Hashtag Instagram. Hashtag photography. Hashtag photo. Hashtag 200 followers. Hashtag follow me. Hashtag let's be friends.